All roads lead to Rome. But is it the Rome we know? Before us lies the eternal city, majestic and full of mysteries. On one hand, we see the grand structures of antiquity, the Colosseum, the Roman Forum, the Pantheon, witnesses to the power of an ancient civilization dating back to the first centuries AD. On the other hand, our eyes are dazzled by the masterpieces of the Renaissance, like St. Peter's Basilica, created by the geniuses of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. These two layers of history are on the surface, obvious and well studied, but between them lies a huge unexplained gap. Ask yourself a simple question. Where are the architectural monuments created between these two great eras? Where are the buildings from the 9th, 10th, or 11th centuries, for example? According to the official version of history, they don't exist. We're told they either burned down, were destroyed, or were completely rebuilt. We are asked to believe that an entire 1,000-year period, the so-called early Middle Ages, left not a single significant stone footprint in the heart of one of the world's greatest empires. This seems suspicious, to say the least. An entire 1,000 years simply vanished as if it never happened. We are used to trusting textbooks and official chronologies, but what if this neat picture of the world is just an illusion? What if history was written not to tell the truth, but to hide it? We are embarking on a fascinating investigation to find the answers. We will look for clues not in dusty archives, but in the very stone that Rome is built from, in its walls, its temples, and even in the symbols that adorn the tombs of its rulers. This journey promises to be full of discoveries that could change your perception of the past forever. If the history of Italian Rome is full of inconsistencies, then perhaps we are really looking in the wrong place. But before we go in search of another, perhaps the true Rome, let's take a closer look at the evidence that lies right at our feet, in the very center of the city we've always considered to be the one and only. Our investigation begins in the Vatican, a state within a state, the residence of the Roman popes. It is within its walls that the first, and perhaps most important clue is hidden, a clue that calls the entire official timeline into question. Official history claims that these powerful fortifications, known as the Leonine Wall, were built in the mid-9th century under the direction of Pope Leo IV. Their purpose was to protect against sea raids by Arab Muslims who had recently plundered the old St. Peter's Basilica. And within this seemingly straightforward historical fact lies the first serious anomaly. Look at the shape of these fortifications. They aren't just high walls, they are a complex system of bastions, designed so that defenders could create a crossfire, leaving no blind spots for attackers. This type of sophisticated and effective fortification, known as a star fort or Italian tracé, according to the very same official history, only became widespread in Europe in the 16th century with the development of artillery. It was the advent of powerful cannons that made old medieval walls useless and forced military engineers to invent a new geometry of bastions capable of withstanding cannonballs. This means that Rome was a whole 700 years ahead of the military engineering of the entire planet. Could 9th century engineers have created a fortification perfectly suited to withstand cannons that would only appear centuries later? It seems absolutely incredible. Either we have to admit that the 9th century Vatican was home to visionary geniuses, or we have to assume that these walls were built much later, precisely in the 16th century, and their history was deliberately aged. But the walls are just the tip of the iceberg. Let's look deeper at the building material used not only in the Vatican, but throughout ancient Rome. On one hand, we have the Pantheon, the temple of all gods, built, we are assured, almost 2,000 years ago, in 126 AD. On the other, St. Peter's Basilica, erected during the Renaissance in the 16th and 17th centuries. Between them lies a gap of 1,500 years. But if we look at their brickwork, we see something astonishing. The same size, the same characteristic red color, the same technology of industrial firing. Historians ask us to believe the incredible, that after the fall of the Roman Empire, the technology for producing high-quality fired brick was completely forgotten in Europe for 1,000 years. Just think about it. Humanity, having learned to build warm, strong, and durable houses, suddenly forgets this basic and extremely useful technology, only to remember it again centuries later. Can you forget fire, the wheel, or the potter's wheel?
Brick production is essentially the same technology as firing ceramic pottery, just on industrial scale. This isn't complex nuclear physics, but a basic manufacturing process. Brick houses are 4 to 5 times warmer than stone ones, and their construction is less labor-intensive than quarrying and laying stone blocks. In the cold European climate, abandoning such a technology is equivalent to voluntarily stepping back into the Stone Age. It's simply illogical.
These two anomalies, the walls from the wrong time and the brick that survived a 1,000-year amnesia, cannot be mere coincidences. They suggest that the entire official timeline of events may be wrong. What if the time gap between the Pantheon and St. Peter's Basilica is artificial? What if these buildings, presented to us as creations of distant eras, were actually built around the same time, using the same technologies? If so, the entire history of Italian Rome begins to crumble like a house of cards. This forces us to return to the question asked earlier. If here, in the heart of the Catholic world, we see signs of possible falsification, shouldn't we look for the true center of that ancient empire elsewhere? Perhaps in the city that historians modestly called the Second Rome. If the history of Italian Rome is full of such glaring inconsistencies and anomalies, then we must ask ourselves, are we looking in the right place? There's a famous ancient proverb that everyone knows: all roads lead to Rome. It's a beautiful, figurative phrase that has become an axiom. But let's for a moment turn away from the history books and just look at a map. Geography is a stubborn and impartial science. Do all the world's roads really lead to the Apennine Peninsula? Italian Rome is located on the so-called Apennine Butte, off the main thoroughfares of Eurasia. To get there, you have to deliberately turn off the main routes and head into a kind of geographical dead end. It's a wonderful place for a vacation, but it's hard to call it a natural center where all the threads of world trade and politics converge. Now let's transport ourselves mentally to the east, to the city now called Istanbul, but formerly known as Constantinople. Look at its location. It's a perfect center, a true crossroads of civilizations. Here, in the narrow strait of the Bosphorus, sea and land routes from Asia, Europe, and Africa meet. Caravan trails from Persia and China, trade routes from North Africa and Central Asia, and river arteries from the depths of Europe all lead here. To control this city is to hold the key to all trade locks, to manage the financial and commodity flows of entire continents. It is precisely such a place that would logically be called the center of a great empire, where all roads truly lead. There is another interesting clue hidden in the name itself. Italian Rome is called the Eternal City. But let's listen to the name of its eastern rival, Constantinople. At its root is the word constant, which means permanent, unchanging. In essence, this is a direct translation of the concept of eternal. Historians, of course, call Constantinople the Second Rome, but what if they simply got the order wrong? What if, judging by brick technology and geographical location, it is Italian Rome that is the second, younger city, and the true original Rome was the city on the Bosphorus?
Based on these facts, a bold but logical theory emerges. Constantinople was the true center of the great empire we call Roman, and Italian Rome was, at that time, just a provincial backwater town. Its history before the second half of the 15th century was quite modest. The main cities in central Italy then were Florence, the capital of the powerful Duchy of Etruria, and Siena, the first capital of the Papal States after the expulsion of the last Latin patriarch from Constantinople. Incidentally, the symbol of Siena, like Rome, is a she-wolf. This is no mere coincidence. It suggests that these cities were closely connected, and for a long time, the primacy was not held by Rome. It seems that at some point in history, a grand substitution took place. The modest history of a provincial Italian town was artificially extended, filled with events and achievements that actually belonged to another, true Rome, Constantinople. But here arises the most important and complex question. If Italian Rome was just a province, how did it manage to become the center of the most influential and wealthy organization in the world, the Roman Catholic Church? And what, in that case, was the Roman Empire really, if its capital was in a completely different place and its history was possibly deliberately distorted? The answer to this question may be even more shocking than the idea of moving the world's capital itself. To understand how a modest Italian city could rise to the pinnacle of the world and become the center of a powerful organization, we need to completely discard our usual notion of empires. We were taught that history is first and foremost the history of wars and conquests, but wars are merely the consequences of failed treaties. At the foundation of any civilization lie production, trade, and economics.
Armies are only needed to protect economic development and maintain order. If we look at the past from this perspective, a completely different picture emerges. The Roman Empire was not a unified state in our modern sense, with a rigid, centralized government and an autocratic emperor. It was rather a global economic system, a kind of corporation or franchise that united many different lands and peoples under its banner. The foundation of this system was not so much the legions, but two other, far more powerful tools: a unified set of rules, known to us as Roman law, and a single centralized financial system. This system was extremely beneficial for all its participants. Local princes and rulers, by joining this corporation, gained access to a huge market for their products. Peasants and artisans could sell their goods far beyond their native principality, ensuring stability and prosperity.
But there was a price to pay for joining this advantageous system. And here we come to the key link in the whole structure, to the force that was not just a spiritual leader, but the true financial center of this empire. That force was the church. It was the church that controlled all banking and monetary circulation. How did it manage this? Very simply, it declared the charging of interest, or usury, to be a grave sin for any private individual. By forbidding everyone else from engaging in lending, the church effectively monopolized all financial activity. Its churches and monasteries, scattered throughout the empire, were not just places for prayer. They were branches of a giant bank, repositories of valuables, and centers for credit and monetary operations. Now it becomes clear why many of them look like impregnable fortresses. They were protecting not only holy relics, but also very tangible assets. And what role did the emperors play in this system? They were not absolute monarchs as they are presented to us. The emperors were, in essence, hired top managers, leaders of the Roman legions, analogous to governors general. They were appointed by the Roman Senate, a sort of board of directors for this corporation. The emperor's main task was to maintain order in his assigned territory and protect trade routes. But they had a second equally important function, a financial one. Emperors on the ground purchased gold and silver in ingots and minted coins from them, denarii and aurae. With this money, they paid the legionaries and also purchased food and other goods for the army's needs. This is why hordes of Roman coins are found so far from Italy, for example in modern-day Poland and Ukraine. These are not traces of conquests, but evidence of trade operations. Roman legions paid with sound currency for wheat grown on the fertile black soil. Thus, a coherent and logical model emerges, a giant economic system based on unified laws, where financial control is entirely in the hands of the church, and emperors function as managers and heads of security. This powerful and seemingly unshakable financial religious monopoly ensured stability for a long time. But nothing lasts forever. Gradually, new, wealthy, and ambitious players began to appear on the historical stage. National monarchies that no longer wanted to tolerate the dictates of the church bank. They wanted to break this system and gain control over finances for themselves. What happened when this colossal tension between the old monopoly and the new forces reached its boiling point? We know this confrontation as the Reformation and the religious wars. But behind the disputes of faith lay a brutal struggle for economic dominance. And it is at the epicenter of this struggle that the key to the most terrible secret of the Vatican lies.
The conflict that shattered this well-oiled economic system is known to us from textbooks as the Reformation. It is presented to us as a purely religious dispute, a clash of theological doctrines, but in reality, it was a brutal and uncompromising war for control of the global financial system. It was, to use modern language, a hostile takeover attempt, where the new national monarchies rose up against the old transnational corporation, the Church. And it is at the very heart of this financial and ideological cataclysm that the solution to the greatest secret of Christianity lies. A secret that was so carefully hidden that it took centuries and the rewriting of entire volumes of world history to conceal it. Prepare yourself, because the following hypothesis may seem shocking and even blasphemous, but it flows logically from all the preceding inconsistencies. What if the central event of Roman Christianity, the martyrdom that ended the earthly journey of the Apostle Peter, did not happen in the 1st century AD, in the distant era of ancient emperors? What if this event occurred 1,500 years later, at the very epicenter of the Reformation, in the 16th century? According to this version, Peter was not just a distant historical symbol, he was a real living participant in those events, a supporter of Martin Luther's ideas. Luther and his followers, the Protestants, demanded that the church be cleansed of everything non-Christian. And what was the most non-Christian element in the papacy structure from an economic point of view? Of course, its monopoly on banking, lending, and the collection of interest, everything that turned the church from a spiritual institution into a giant commercial enterprise. It turns out that Peter was an internal reformer who spoke out against the Vatican's financial system from within, and for this, he was subjected to the ultimate punishment. This seems incredible, but let's go back to St. Peter's Basilica and look at the evidence left in stone. Let's approach the tombs of the popes who reigned during that very era. Here, for example, is the tomb of Pope Gregory XIII. On either side of the pontiff's figure, we see not angels or saints, but pagan deities. On the right is Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, and notably war. On the left is Clio, the muse of history, daughter of Zeus. Now let's look at the tomb of Pope Leo XI. The same picture. To his right is Fortuna, the goddess of chance and fate, holding a cornucopia. And to his left is the same warlike Minerva, with a shield. Where is the Christian symbolism here? Where are the crosses, the images of Christ or the Virgin Mary? They are absent.
This is direct proof that before the Reformation, the papacy was not a purely Christian religion in our understanding. It was a pantheon, a temple of all permitted gods, a complex, syncretic system where Christianity was just one of many faiths. The book of the papal legate, Antonio Posavino, who visited Moscow during the time of Ivan the Terrible, directly records the Russian Tsar's words that the faith of Rome was divided into 60 different beliefs and confessions. In such a system, a person who, like Luther and his supporters, declared Christianity to be the one and only exclusive religion and demanded to get rid of everything else, was not just a heretic. He was a revolutionary, undermining the very foundations of power and, more importantly, the financial well-being of the Vatican. But if Peter was eliminated in the 16th century, then who was his executioner? History conveniently offers us the image of the cruel Emperor Nero. But what if Nero is just a historical pseudonym, a convenient mask hiding the true face? According to the researcher Alexander Tomaneski, the ancient Roman Nero, who supposedly watched the apostles' execution, is none other than Pope Leo X, the very pontiff who reigned during Martin Luther's time and excommunicated him. If this is true, then something monstrous emerges. The Church itself, in the person of its supreme hierarch, eliminated the man who would later become its main symbol and the gatekeeper of heaven. This is the greatest deception in history, a grand mystification. But if all of this is true, the main question arises: how did they manage to cover up this crime? How could history be rewritten on such a massive scale that entire generations of people for 500 years did not even suspect a forgery? How did they manage to make the whole world believe in a fictional timeline? Now all the pieces of this complex puzzle fall into a single, albeit shocking picture. The mysterious disappearance of 1,000 years from Rome's history, the Vatican walls built with future technology, the timeless brick, and finally, the pagan symbols on papal tombs. All these are not random anomalies, but links in a single chain, details of one grand design. We have arrived at the answer to the main question: why was this 1,000-year lie created? The answer is both simple and monstrous. To hide the greatest crime and preserve its power, which was based on a financial monopoly, the Vatican carried out what was perhaps the most massive operation of historical falsification. It needed to conceal two inconvenient facts. First, the true commercial nature of the Church as a global banking corporation, and second, the elimination of a key figure of internal dissent, a reformer who dared to challenge this financial system. The events of the 16th century, the Reformation, the Schism, and the tragic end of the Apostle Peter's life were simply removed from their era and, as if in a time machine, artificially sent back 1,500 years to the safe antiquity of the 1st century AD.
This brilliant move solved several problems at once. First, it turned a real and very painful internal conflict into a distant, almost mythical story of early Christians struggling against cruel pagan emperors. Second, it securely hid the economic motives for the execution behind the screen of religious persecution. But this manipulation of time created a huge problem. A colossal chronological gap of 1,500 years formed between the 1st and 16th centuries, which needed to be filled urgently. Thus was born the era we know as the Dark Ages, a convenient historical vacuum that could be filled with any content. It was to fill this void that entire dynasties of fictional rulers were invented, non-existent empires were drawn on maps, and chronicles were written about wars that may never have happened. Thus, the entire history we know is, in essence, a brilliantly executed marketing move, a commercial project created to legitimize power and conceal inconvenient truths. And the apotheosis of this project was the transformation of its own eliminated opponent into its main symbol and brand. The man who went against the financial system of the church was posthumously appointed its guardian. The keys of Apostle Peter, which he held, became more than just a symbol of faith. They became a symbol of absolute power over the main asset of this corporation, human souls. The golden key to the gates of heaven and the silver key to the gates of purgatory. This is the key to the monopoly on forgiveness, and consequently to the most profitable commodity of that era, indulgences. Without them, the chances of wealthy parishioners getting into heaven were negligible.